Welcome to the Made for Agriculture podcast with Adam, Cameron, and Emily. Today's host is Emily Beck.
So, hello everyone. Welcome to the Made for Agriculture podcast. Today we are going to be talking to someone from Midwest Labs. We're going to be discussing different points with Midwest Labs. We're going to look at some soil sampling, when to soil sample, some key takeaways with soil sample results, but also just a little bit more about Midwest Labs. So, without further ado, I will let our guest introduce himself and give us some background on Midwest Labs.
Thank you, Emily. I appreciate the opportunity. My name is Jim Grilliot. I am an agronomist and field representative for Midwest Laboratories. I've been with the lab for 22 years. And prior to that, I was in ag retail for about 9 years, a little over 9 years, mostly in South Central Kansas. I work as a field rep, as I mentioned, and an agronomist. So I spend time with existing clients doing training, help with interpreting reports, and always looking for new clientele.
And always answering our MFA questions.
Always answering the questions the best I can, yes.
I know I've called you a couple times.
Yeah, and I appreciate that.
Can you tell us just a little bit about Midwest Labs? Because MFA does utilize them because we think that you guys are definitely the cream of the crop whenever it comes to soil sampling.
You bet. I appreciate that comment. Midwest Labs started in 1975 as a soil and plant testing lab, and we have obviously expanded from there. But specifically on the soil side, we still use the same extraction methods that we were using back in 75, and that has a lot of value to our clients and you guys as well. I feel sure. Now we have made advancements and developed some efficiencies in-house that have allowed us to keep the turnaround time we desire and you desire, but the extraction methods are the same. And again, I point that out because there are a lot of different methods out there, extraction methods, and we feel that our methods are still the methods that have the most correlation and calibration to fertilizer recommendations. So feel very confident in that, and I believe our clients do as well.
So without going in too much detail, how does Midwest Labs methods differ from those of other companies like you had mentioned?
So, for instance, a phosphorus method is what comes to mind at first. So we use the Bray method on phosphorus, Bray 1 and Bray 2. And then on alkaline soil, highly alkaline soil, we will do the Olsen bicarbonate test. Because the Bray falls off as far as reliability as you get into highly alkaline soil. Another method that's out there and has become popular is the Malic 3. Mm-hmm. And it is a very good extraction method on acid soils, just like the Bray test is. It falls off as you get into highly alkaline soils as far as reliability. But when we compare Bray 1, for instance, versus Malic 3 on phosphorus, mm-hmm. That Malic 3 is going to be roughly 30% higher than that Bray 1 value. I say roughly. Mm-hmm. It will depend on soil pH, but that would be the difference. So you couldn't use that Malic 3 value with your existing equations, mm-hmm. Because they would not work. So that is the difference. It's not that it's a better or worse extraction method for phosphorus. It's just different. It's a mm-hmm. stronger acid extraction, so it's going to pull out more phosphorus from that sample.
Okay. That's always good to know. And then talking about soil sampling, with harvest season occurring across MFA's tray territory at different stages, since our tray territory is so wide, is there a better time to take soil samples? Right now it is fall. Is fall versus spring, when you're looking at those time frames, is there a better time to take the soil samples?
Well, yes and no. And I say that because ideally I want the best conditions when sampling. So if the fall, and generally the fall is when most are taken, but you think about the fall, the moisture you get over winter and then spring. I mean, I think most people would agree that the condition of that soil in the spring is pretty ideal. However, we tend to get a lot of rain in the spring, and it can be difficult to get all those acres covered. So my thoughts are, take the sample when it works best for you, but make sure it's a good sample. If it's too dry to take a sample, wait till you can take a sample. And I know that's a difficult discussion, especially when there are numerous acres to pull. But if you're taking a core, let's say you're taking 10 to 12 cores to represent a field or grid point.
Mm-hmm.
And if each of those cores are at different depths, 4 inches, 6, 5, 7, whatever it may be, you don't have good data from that sample. You really don't. And so ideally, if you're sampling at a 6-inch depth, you want each of those cores being six inches. And the next time you sample, obviously a 6-inch depth as well. So that's what I'm getting at. And I've always said, if the data is only as good as that sample that was taken. So the idea behind taking samples on a regular basis is you want to be able to see trends. And the only way you'll have good data and be able to see trends is to have a good sample taken. So I'm not concerned with whether it's fall or spring.
Okay.
We have clients that will take them in season, and I don't have a problem with that. Be consistent, but if the time you normally sample, the conditions are not good, wait until you can sample.
Okay, so right now, with some of our tray territory being in a very light drought, and not having much rain, I know some of us may have gotten some of that hurricane rain coming forward. The ground can be very hard. And so not going out there with a hammer, trying to get your soil samples out and making sure that they are the adequate depth is definitely, with that compaction that's going on right now with the dryness. Or not compaction,
it is. And you're going to see fluctuations, especially with potassium, but also phosphorus, seasonal fluctuations. So, in other words, that potassium value that you see, let's say if you take the sample now versus what it will be, let's say the end of March, will be different. Now, is it significant? It's not terribly significant. It can be explained, in other words. However, if you are getting regular rains toward the end of that growing season, and when harvest is over, you can easily get a good core pulled. That fluctuation has already begun, or that potassium, for instance, moving back into the soil has already begun, versus if you are dry towards the end of the growing season, you don't get that washing of the residue and moving that nutrient back into the soil. So it's just delayed until you get decent moisture. But again, I discourage taking samples when it's difficult to do so.
Okay. And just a thought that I had talking about that. I know you said that as long as you're consistent, as long as you're getting that consistency when you're taking the samples, even if it's in season, whenever we are applying fertilizer, is there a time frame after that fertilizer has been applied, or maybe manure or any nutrients, that you then wait for a soil sample to be taken? Is there any guidelines with that?
It does depend on whether you're no-till or conventional till, because if you can incorporate whatever, whether it's an organic or commercial fertilizer, that certainly makes a difference. You're spreading that fertilizer out over a more significant area. But generally, I just as a rule of thumb, I would say 2 weeks,
Okay.
and just to be safe.
Okay. Okay.
Certainly moisture makes a difference in whether you receive rainfall, but I would say a good 2 weeks is a good rule of thumb.
Okay. And then I know that you had talked about taking cores, 10 to 12 cores. I didn't know if you could discuss precision sampling or grid soil sampling and how those cores are correlated with that grid soil sampling.
Yeah, so just to be sure I understand your question, how grid samples correlate with, could you say that again?
Yeah. So whenever you're out in the field and we have our grids set up, you had mentioned that you would take 10 to 12 cores in that area to get a good representation. I'm assuming that's whenever you're saying when you're doing your grid soil sampling that, you're taking all those spots that's more representative.
Sure, and really what I'm talking about is, so you have made the field boundaries, and the software then drops in your 2.5 acre grid, and the GPS gets you to the center of that grid, and you're taking samples in and around that point. I believe that's what you're getting at.
Yes,
Okay.
yes. I
Yes.
apologize for being foggy on it.
Okay. All right. Yeah, that's really what it's about, and again, it's a representation of that grid point.
And for someone that works for a company that does analyze soil sampling, have you seen a benefit in doing grid soil sampling as opposed to composite soil sampling?
Yeah, I certainly have, and I honestly I witnessed that the very first precision sampling event that I was involved with back in the 90s. So it was a quarter section of land, and we did 2.5 acre grids, and the pH on that quarter section varied from 4.5 to 7.8. So we had a loamy sand on the west portion of this field with a 4.5 pH, and we had a calcareous soil on the opposite end of that field. And so that really made a believer out of me. And, had we sampled that even west 80 versus east 80, we still would have applied lime on that portions of that east 80 where it was 7.8 pH. So you may be putting more or less lime on that acreage, but the point is you're putting it where it needs to be, and that's really the point of precision agriculture and the benefits of it. So, yeah, there's absolutely a benefit from precision ag and precision sampling, grid sampling.
And I guess I'll put in a shameless pun on that is the MFA. I mean, we have NutriTrack. We utilize those grid soil sampling. So whether you're corn or beans, wheat, forage, anything, be able to utilize that soil nutrients at such a level to maximize production. And so being able to do that, you not only have the savings of bringing in more yields, but also, like you were saying, for that nutrient aspect, not blanket applying, but having more of a prescription for your field. Yeah, we
Yeah,
definitely have seen that
absolutely.
as well.
Absolutely. Very good point.
But looking at our trade territory, or looking at, not our trade territory, I apologize, but soil samples. And we've already talked about when the best time is to do soil sampling, but also, grid soil sampling is better when we look at those results, because that's what we're really wanting. We're wanting those nuggets of knowledge. So looking at those results, what are the first things that we need to look at, or what are the key takeaways when looking at all those numbers that are on the results?
Sure. And I'm gonna put a report up here, share with everyone, and that way we can kind of get an idea what we're looking at here. So this is just uh, a report or a couple of samples that I did a few years back. But and can you see this okay, Emily?
Yes. Yes,
Okay,
looks
right.
perfect.
So the first thing that I look at is pH. In Missouri, in the Midwest, and in the Midwest in general, a lot of lime is applied, and so I want to look at that pH and see where we're at, and if a correction needs to be made, I want to make sure that's done. The second aspect would probably be the major nutrients, phosphorus and potassium in particular. So when I look at phosphorus, I'm looking at the first column on the left there, and our target is 25 parts per million. And our Midwest Labs philosophy is a build and maintain philosophy. So, and I believe yours, MFA,
Yes.
are as well. And
Yep.
so what that means is we're going to put on crop removal, and we're going to try to build to that level in a certain amount of years. For Midwest, it's 4 years. I believe you guys have the option of
Extending those out.
Of extending that, yes.
Mm-hmm.
All right, for potassium, we're looking at roughly 200 parts per million, and so we're trying to build to that. Now, one thing to keep in mind with these cations, and especially potassium, is that it does depend on the CEC, the cation exchange capacity, and you may have a sandy loam versus a silty clay loam, and that potassium level is going to differ as far as a rating with those two soil types. In other words, it's going to take more potassium, or that heavier soil will be able to hold more potassium than that lighter soil. So keep that in mind when looking at those cations. Along those lines, I always want to point out the CEC as well as the percent-based saturation. And I believe that the percent-based saturation does get overlooked. But what we're really looking for in that section is a range that we'd like to be in. And with potassium, we'd like to be between 2.5 to 5.5, 6, somewhere in there. With magnesium, ideally, I'd like to be between 10 and 16. And then calcium between 65 and 75. Hydrogen is directly related to pH. So as that soil becomes more acid, you have an increase in hydrogen ions. And when you add lime, you replace those hydrogen ions with calcium ions. But ideally, if we're going to put a number to that base saturation, hydrogen percentage, it would be 10% or less. And you can see the difference in those two samples. All right, with sodium's not a desirable nutrient. We'd like to keep that below 1% if at all possible. As you get near 2%, you can start affecting crop production in certain plants. 3% will generally affect all crops. All right, and then when we look at the bottom section of that report, we're looking at nitrate. And just understand that that is nitrate only. It's not ammonium. So there are two forms of nitrogen. And just understand that that is nitrate. And so if there is a situation where, for instance, in early spring where you're perhaps there's been a lot of early rain and you want to, there may be a need for some additional nitrogen. You want to find out how much nitrogen is in that soil. It would be of benefit to request not only nitrate, but ammonium nitrogen as well. So just keep that in mind. We have a parts per million value as well as a pounds per acre for that depth. Bottom right section, sulfur and the micronutrients. Really a trend that we see or have seen with sulfur in particular is low levels, low to very low levels. And that goes back 10 to 15 years. As industries have deposited less sulfur onto the soil, we see that in most soil reports. For the micronutrients, fairly straightforward with regard to what we're looking at. We have a table of ratings that we have available on our portal that you can utilize. But the key thing to understand about the micros is it's really the opposite of our major and secondary nutrients. We apply lime so that we are near that 6.5 to 7 pH, because that's where those major and secondary nutrients are most soluble. Well, that's the opposite of the micros. They are extremely soluble at a 5 pH and below, well, 5.5 and below. But as you get near 7 and then alkaline, they're very insoluble. So we have to treat those micronutrients a little different as far as how we deliver them. And so that's really the key takeaway for the micros is what that delivery method is. And it may not be a broadcast delivery, but that's certainly something to think about. The last two columns on that report are excess lime rate and soluble salts. The excess lime rating is simply just that. We are putting a drop of acid on a subsample of your soil sample and watching it how it reacts. And that just gives us an indication of how much free lime is in the soil. And so we're giving it a low, medium, or high rating. The soluble salt value is, when we think of salts, or when most people think of salts, they think of sodium. But soluble salts are not only sodium, but potassium, magnesium, and calcium as well. And so that is just a value that represents all of those salts. And we'd like to stay below 1 on that as well. So with that, are there any questions that you have, Emily, before we move from this report?
I think you covered everything nicely, and it's showing me that maybe we need even another podcast to discuss these in more detail and how they affect plants. So maybe a future podcast, we can
Certainly.
dabble more in that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the other thing that we had folks discuss is whenever we're looking at all these results, because you do cover all the questions that we would have for our whole trade territory, which is all of Missouri, southern Iowa, eastern Kansas, and northern Arkansas. And what trends do you see from looking at all these results? And it may not just be for our trade territory, but just kind of seeing in general from the results that you receive.
Yeah, I think the biggest trend that I've noticed over the past few years is magnesium levels, high magnesium levels. And I would attribute that to years and years of Dolomitic lime applications. So Dolomitic lime is a lime that has generally 10 to 12% magnesium, and I've seen it even higher than that. I've seen it up close to 20%, but in general, 10 to 12% magnesium. And so when you have applied that Dolomitic lime let's say every 5 years for the past 10, 20, 30 years, you've got to build up a magnesium. And when that happens, I mentioned the base saturation range. And so when you get above 20% and especially 25% magnesium base saturation, you start to develop some, you can develop some structure issues where compaction becomes a problem. But the other issue is antagonism, and that high magnesium is affecting uptake of other nutrients, potassium and phosphorus, as well as calcium and some micronutrients. So that's really a concern, and it's a trend that I see across my region, into Kansas and across Missouri and into other areas as well. So something to look out for. Look where your base saturation magnesium is at.
Okay.
I mentioned sulfur just a minute ago, and I think that's a trend that everybody sees and has seen for the past several years. I mean, again, as in the Midwest, you're going to see low to very low sulfur most generally. As you go west, it certainly changes where there's less rainfall and where irrigation water may not be the best quality. But those would be the main trends that I have seen in the recent years.
Okay. That's really interesting to know about that. And I guess if this is a silly question or not, but how do you know if you have Dolomitic lime? And I don't know if I even said that right.
That's correct. So there's Dolomitic lime and there's calcitic lime, and it's really about the amount of magnesium that's in that. They both have calcium carbonate in them, and they both have magnesium carbonate in them. Calcitic will have generally less than 4% magnesium. We do a lot of lime testing in the lab, and I see them a fraction of 1% magnesium quite often. A Dolomitic lime, as I mentioned before, will generally be 10 to 12% or higher.
Okay. So one other question I had before we wrapped up was Midwest Labs has been around for quite some time, like you had mentioned, and you guys are well known within MFA's trade territory. But how many samples do you guys receive at peak time? And what is the typical turnaround time for those soil samples?
Okay. So our peak time is coming up in the fall, and really from the first part of October until a lot of the Midwest and Plains freeze is our busiest time. And we actually hit a record last year of over 2 million samples in the year 2023. And
wow.
So in our peak time, we have the ability to run 30,000 samples a day. Our tables in our receiving room can hold 6,000 samples. So during that peak time, we will run based on that 6,000 number. And so we'll go through 6,000 samples, and we may do 24,000 in a day. We may do 30. We may do 18, but because of the layout, and what the trend seems to be for the week, will guide us in how we're going to, or how many we'll do on a certain day. Now, as I said, we have the ability to do 30, and as far as turnaround, and this really speaks to what I mentioned earlier, the efficiencies, the advancements that we've made in-house have allowed us to keep our same turnaround time, even though our volume has increased over the years. Our turnaround time continues to be 3 business days.
Wow.
So if we receive a sample on Wednesday, it will be reported on Friday. Now, being our peak time coming up, there will occasionally be a 4th day during that time frame, because and weather certainly plays a role in this. I mean, we've had some days where maybe there were certain regions that were dry, and then finally did get some rain, and so a week later we get a flush of samples, and we may have 40,000 in a day. Well, we certainly don't have the ability to do 40 in a day, so that's where you may have an extra day turnaround. Now, we do work Saturdays during this peak volume time, so it's really managing that volume that we get in on a daily basis, and making sure deciding what we're going to do in a day, what we're going to do the next day. And so but that's kind of where we're at in-house at this point in time.
Wow. So you guys have really good time management skills.
Yes, we do. And have to. I mean, we really have to. Each of those samples has gets a number associated with it, and that number is with that sample forever, because that data is archived. And so that's really how we manage the samples and the data for our clients.
And I know that whenever we send in soil samples from our customers through NutriTrack, we will get those numbers back, and then we can put them in a more MFA kind of format for the producers. But if anybody is also just sending in their own soil samples, maybe for a cost share program, other things to that nature, then yes, we'll definitely have those numbers and be able to reach out to anybody with Midwest Labs, because I know that you guys have a really good response team if people have questions, customer service, things to that nature too.
Absolutely, and I appreciate that comment. So there are 6 of us field reps across Midwest and Plains, and then we have 3 agriculture management people in-house that take care of in-house issues, I guess you would say. So account managers would be their title, and so there's always a way to get a hold of someone. And it is a human being answering the phone, by the way. So that is a big deal for me, and I think a lot of people.
I was gonna say that's unheard of nowadays. It's all automated.
Yep.
And I know earlier you had also mentioned the portal. That is one piece of Midwest Labs that I have also utilized on going in. Maybe there's a test result I hadn't done yet, just trying to be more comfortable with it. And you guys do have a lot of training available through your portal, which I think is really nice. And so is it just Midwest Labs, or how do people kind of get that knowledge?
We have a YouTube channel that will allow you to, I believe most of all the marketing that we have available for training purposes is available on YouTube, and that can be accessed from the portal as well.
Okay, perfect. Perfect. But thank you, Jim, very much. I know MFA really appreciates you and all your vast knowledge that you've had. Just some highlights that I had from this podcast is that soil sampling is just being consistent with soil sampling. It could be during any time of the year as long as it's really good conditions to take soil samples. Also, waiting 2 weeks after fertilizer would be best to take the soil samples. Grid soil sampling is the best option when we are looking at soil sampling as opposed to composite soil sampling. And then we also discussed looking over those results to make sure that we understand what we are getting back from Midwest Labs. And then, of course, just how amazing Midwest Labs is in the fact that they can turn around 3 business days and give you your results back. And they also have a YouTube channel that will allow for more training, but even really nice hands-on staff that is going to be a person on the other end of the line, which is a really good aspect. But MFA, like I said, really likes Midwest Labs and really highlighting it through our NutriTrack program. And if anybody is interested in getting enrolled in that, reach out to your local MFA and get started. But thank you, Jim, very much.
Appreciate the comments, Emily. And just one more thing to add. Part of my job is to help interpret data and help with agronomy questions. I've got a lot of experience in ag retail and the years with the lab, so feel free to give me a call and any questions you may have moving forward. So glad to do that.
Yep, and I know that your contact information, both phone and email, is on Midwest Labs, so you could be able to look those up.
That's correct.
But thank you very much, and I'm hoping for a future podcast to dive in even deeper with our soil samples. So stay tuned for one of those.
Sounds great. Thank you again, Emily.
No, thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Made for Agriculture podcast, brought to you by MFA, your whole farm solution.